Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Ayin Gimel Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today 2 lines off the bottom of Kuf Ayin Gimel Amid Aleph with Siman Shin Lamed Aleph Siv Zayin, continuing to learn the halachas that govern Mila on Shabbos. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasunim Batsaru Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakam Yerachem Alehem V'Yitziam Mitzaru L'Rvacha Me'afelo L'Oira U'Mishibud L'Geula Hashtabagalo V'Zman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana, Gila Shifra Bas Ilana Udal Yitzchak ben Tzion ben Dusha, Rivka Bas Shiraleah, and Chava Hadassah Bas Cyril. They should all have a refuah shalema v'seich Shar Chayla Yisrael, the schus of the limud HaTorah of Klal Yisrael. The Rabbi Shalom should watch over every member of Klal Yisrael b'chol Makayim Shehem. Okay, in the very beginning of the Siman, in Siman Shin Lamed Aleph Sif Aleph, the Mechaber told us an interesting thing. The Mechaber said, "Oisim kol tzarchei milah b'Shabbos." You're allowed to do everything that is necessary to perform a proper bris milah on Shabbos. And the Mechaber named certain steps of the process. The Mechaber said, Mayalin, obviously you could do the Milah, you could cut off the Arla, Upairin, and you're allowed to do Priya, where you tear and peel back the Priya, because Priya is also an essential part of the mitzvah of Milah. Umaitzitzin, and you're allowed to do Mitzitza Bepeh, also part of the Milah process. And all 3 of these steps, Mila, Priya, and Mitzitza, all involve Malacha Daraisa. Mila, obviously, you're cutting and you're causing bleeding. That is Chayvel 101, and it's the Telada of the Av Malacha of Netilas Neshama. Pairin also can cause bleeding, and therefore it would also be Chayvel. Moitzitzin is certainly Chayvel, because part of the requirement of Mitzitza is that the moil needs to suck hard enough to draw blood that's absorbed in the tissue beyond the exact point of the wound. So Mitzitza definitely also is the malach of Chayvel. So those 3 steps of the Milah process all involve Isurei Daraisa, and the Mechaber is telling us you're allowed to do it on Shabbos because Milah is Daicha Shabbos. And we learned Milah is Daicha Shabbos. Chazal darshan this from the pasuk, Ubayom Hashmini Yimail Besar Arlasai. The word Ubayom is extra. The pasuk could have said Ubashmini, and on the 8th day. What's Ubayom Hashmini? Chazal darshan from there that Milah Bizmanoi, Milah on day 8, is Daicha Shabbos, and therefore it is perfect, makes perfect sense what the Mechaber tells us here, and he's taking it really comes straight from a Mishnah in Masechta Shabbos, Kuf Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph. Milah is Daicha Shabbos, and you could do Milah, you could do Priya, you could do Mitzitza. But then the Mechaber continued, and the Mechaber said, V'noisden alav kamoin. You're also allowed to put ground cumin onto the wound of the Milah. Now this is something that they did back in the day. This was the medicine that they used. What they did for refuah, for proper care of the wound of the Milah, was they put ground cumin onto the wound. Says the Mechaber, nice that I love kamain. You're allowed to put the ground cumin onto the wound. Now, what isser would there be in putting ground cumin on a wound? That would only be an Issa D'Rabbanan. What Issa D'Rabbanan would it be? Well, it's refuah. Since it's refuah, so that's the Gzera D'Rabbanan, Gzera Mishum Shchika Samamonim. Usually we don't do refuah on Shabbos because we're afraid if people are going to do things for refuah on Shabbos, they might come to grind herbs or spices on Shabbos. So nice that alav kamain is only an Issa D'Rabbanan. And the obvious question, and indeed one listener at least reached out to me and asked me the question. He said, I don't understand. The Mechaber just told me you're allowed to do Moilin, Pairin, Maitzitsin. These all involve Isurei Daraisa. Why is the Mechaber coming along and telling me nice to the Kamain that you're allowed to put cumin on the wound? That's only an Issa D'Rabbanan. If you're allowed to do Isurei Daraisa, certainly you're allowed to do an Issa D'Rabbanan. And it was a very, very good question. The answer to the question, I believe, is that if you take a look in the Mishnah on Shabbos on Kuf Lam and Gimel and Aleph, the lashon of the Mishnah is Oisin kol tzarchei mila b'Shabbos, mayalin upayrin umaytzitzin v'noisden aleha ispalanis. You're allowed to put on a bandage. Again, issa d'Rabbanan. Ukamain, and you're allowed to put on cumin. But that's not where the Mishnah ends. The Mishnah continues, and the Mishnah says, Im loy shachak me erev Shabbos. Oh, let's say you didn't have ground cumin because you neglected to prepare ground cumin on Erev Shabbos. Now you want to go do a bris milah, but you don't have the necessary medication. You don't have ground cumin because you didn't grind it before Shabbos. Says the Mishnah, lo yes b'shinov. You should chew it up. That's going to be the topic that we're going to start today's share with. We're up to Siv Zayin, 2 lines off the bottom, Kuf Ayin Gimel Lamed Aleph, and now the Mechaber is going to discuss the question of what to do if you don't have ground cumin prepared in order to do the bris on Shabbos. So again, just why did I go back to Sif Aleph? I want to show you that in Sif Aleph, when the Mechaber said, Noistin alav kamain, that you could put cumin on, really he's quoting it from the Mishnah. Really, there's no inherent chiddush in the fact, in the halacha, that noistin alav kamain, because that's only an issa d'Rabbanan. But the Mechaber needed to introduce noistin alav kamain in preparation for Siv Zayin. That's where the Mishnah goes next. What do we do if we don't have kamain? So now let's start the Sif. Says the Mechaber, let's say you did not have ground cumin before Shabbos. So now it's Shabbos. You want to do a bris milah. You don't have ground cumin. Are you allowed to go ahead and grind cumin? Do an issa d'oraisa now and grind cumin on Shabbos so that you should be able to do the bris milah? The answer to that would be no. Why? Because grinding cumin is machshirei milah. That is a preparatory step for the bris milah, and it's efshar la'asoisai miba'od yom. That's something that could have been done on Erev Shabbos. And that would bring us to the topic of Sivav, 2 lines off the top on Kuf Ayin Gimel Lamed Aleph. Machshirei milah she'efshar la'asoisai me'erev Shabbos, steps that are preparatory to the bris milah, and they could have been done on Erev Shabbos, einam doichem es Shabbos. They're not doich Shabbos. So you're coming now, it's Shabbos morning, you want to make a bris milah, the moil realizes he doesn't have ground cumin, he can't go grind the cumin now. That's an issa d'oraisa of toichen, of grinding. It's machshirei milah, it's something preparatory for the milah, and it's efshar la'asai samim ba'od yom. It could have been done on Erev Shabbos. You're not allowed to go ahead and do it now. So says the Mechaber in our Sif here, Sif Zayin, Lo yehayel kamain shachuk me Erev Shabbos. If you did not have ground cumin from Erev Shabbos, Lo yishchakenu. You're not allowed to go ahead and grind it. And like I said, the math makes perfect sense. Machshirei milah she'efshar la'asai samim ba'od yom. You're not allowed to do it. Not only are you not allowed to do an issa d'oraisa, you're not even allowed to do an issa d'Rabbanan if it's machshirei milah she'efshar la'asai samim ba'od yom. Now let's pause here for a second and just take a look at the very beginning of Mishnah Berurah's Katan Chav Daled. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Lo yishchakenu, you're not allowed to grind the cumin. Why? The machshirei milah einam doichem es haShabbos. Because machshirei milah efshar la'asai samim ba'od yom. It's not doich Shabbos. You're not allowed to do it. So that so far is very simple. Now we go to the next piece of the Mechaber, which is what the Mishnah says at Kuf Lam and Gimel, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated. Says the Mechaber, Lo yishchakenu, you can't grind the cumin. Ella, what should you do? Lo yes b'shinov. You should chew it up with your teeth. Now, this gets complicated. So, you want to go ahead and do the bris. You don't have ground cumin. Says the Mechaber, chew it up with your teeth. Now, what does chewing it up with your teeth accomplish? I mean, it accomplishes that it gets you ground cumin. But why are you allowed to do that? Well, grinding it up with your teeth is doing toichen. You're grinding up the cumin, but you're doing it with a shinui. You're doing it in an abnormal way. So since you're doing toichen klach hayad, you're doing toichen with a shinui, now it's not an issa d'oraisa, it's an issa d'Rabbanan. But how does that help us? right? We said machshirei mila she'efshar la'asaisa mib'od yom are not doiche Shabbos, even by an Issa D'Rabbanan. What's the classic example? The classic example that we had was, if you want to do a bris milah on Shabbos, and you don't have the sakin, the moil doesn't have the knife. Where's the knife? The knife is in another house in the chotzer, and it's a chotzer she'ena mu'ureves. You have another house in the same chotzer as you, but there's no Eruv Chatzeris. So now to take the knife out of unit 15 and bring it to unit 21 would be an Issa D'Rabbanan. It would be Haitzah D'Rabbanan. Are you allowed to bring the knife to do the milah? No. Why? Because it's machshirei milah. It's preparatory. You need to bring the knife. You need the knife for the milah. And it's efshar la'asaisa mib'od yom. You should have brought the knife on Erev Shabbos. You didn't do it. Now you're going to have to push off the milah. So machshirei milah that are efshar la'asaisa mib'od yom are not doiche Shabbos even by Yisrei D'Rabbanan. So what does it mean over here? And it's not just the mechaber. What does the Mishnah mean? The Mishnah says you don't have ground cumin, go ahead and grind up cumin with your teeth. Well, grinding up cumin with your teeth is an Issa D'Rabbanan. Why is that mutter? So the truth is that this is a fascinating sugya, and there's a big machlokes Rishonim over here. But the way the Rishonim understand this is you have to understand how the shaila is happening. What we're not saying that the moil should go set up the milah. You know, he comes with his moil bag, and he puts out his chuck, you know, his throw cloth, sterile. He puts out his knife and everything else. He realizes he doesn't have cumin. Oh, he should go take cumin, grind it up in his teeth, prepare the ground cumin over there, and now he could do the milah. The Rishonim say, no, that's not what the Mishnah means. That would be usser, because that would be machshirei milah, efshar la'asaisa mib'od yom, an Issa D'Rabbanan of teichen klachayad, that would be usser. What does the mechaber mean, and what does the Mishnah mean that if he doesn't have ground cumin, lo yishchakenu ela lo yes b'shinav, it means after the bris. What the Mishnah and the mechaber means is, you don't have ground cumin, go ahead and do the bris. After the bris, now you could go ahead and you could grind up cumin with your teeth, and you could go use it to treat the baby. Why? Why would that be okay? Oh, the reason that that's okay is because now you're dealing with an Issa D'Rabbanan, and you're dealing with a chayla sheyesh by sakana. Now you have a baby, you have a tinuk, a rachanimoil, a baby that just had a bris. The proper treatment that he requires is he needs ground cumin put on the wound. He's definitely considered a chayla sheyesh by sakana. So okay, so you want to do an Issa D'Rabbanan, even if you're going to call him a chayla sheyesh by sakana, an Issa D'Rabbanan with a shino you're allowed to do. So okay, so you'll go well, I don't know if this is not an Issa D'Rabbanan with a shino. It's an Issa D'Rabbanan because it is a shino. But now go ahead and chew up the cumin and put the cumin on the wound. Now, it gets even a little bit more complicated, but let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah first. So again, before we go into the Mishnah Berurah, so what's the halacha here? The way I'm learning it, what's the halacha here that the mechaber is telling you? The mechaber is saying like this: you want to go ahead and you want to do the bris, and you realize that you don't have ground cumin. Are you allowed to go ahead and grind cumin? No, you're not allowed to go ahead and grind cumin. So this is the daraisa of teichen, and you know, it's machshirei milah she'efshar la'asaisa mib'od yom. No, you can't go ahead and grind cumin. Okay, are you allowed to grind cumin with your teeth before the milah? No, it's an Issa D'Rabbanan, machshirei milah efshar la'asaisa mib'od yom. You're not even allowed to do an Issa D'Rabbanan. What should you do? Do the bris milah. After you do the bris milah, now you're dealing with a rachanimoil, you're dealing with a chayla. Now go ahead, grind up cumin with your teeth and put cumin onto the wound. Now, against that backdrop, let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, I'll start from the beginning of Chaf Dalet. Lo yishchakenu, you can't grind up the cumin to machshirei milah enam doichem es haShabbos, because machshirei milah are not doiche Shabbos. Val kain, and therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, let's say let's say you want to go do the bris, you don't have ground cumin, and you can't go ahead and chew up the cumin to grind the cumin. Why can't you? I don't know. Kasha oifamaisa. It's very hard and you have dentures. So you're not going to be able to go ahead and chew it up, and you're not going to have ground cumin. Well, in that case, says the Chavetz Chaim, tidacha hamila. you would have to postpone the milah because there's no choice. You can't grind the cumin in preparation for the milah. So you're going to have to postpone the milah to Yom Rishon. And, says the Mishnah Berurah, V'lav davka shchika shehi malacha. This is not only true by toichin daraisa, that you would have to postpone the milah because you can't do the toichin. Ela afilu lahavi kamain derech mavui she'en meshutef nami aser ukidalel sivav. Even if somebody says, oh, there's ground cumin in unit 13, and we don't have it in Ruvei Chatzeres, you can't bring it. Because yes, that's an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's only an Issa D'Rabbanan, but you can't do Issurei D'Rabbanan if it's Makshirei Mila She'ef Shalah Saisa Miba'od Yom. So you can't bring the ground cumin from unit 13. V'chein, and similarly, so let's pause here for just a second. So what are we seeing? So you can't grind the cumin, it's an Issa D'Oraisa, it's not Doicha Shabbos. You can't bring the cumin through and through the chotzer if it's a chotzer she'enim ureves because it's a tzad d'Rabbanan. And again, it's Makshirei Mila Efshalah Saisam Ba'od Yom. You're not allowed to do it. By the same token, before you do the bris, you're not allowed to chew up the cumin, to grind the cumin, because that's also an Issa D'Rabbanan. It's Toichet Klachayad, it's an Issa D'Rabbanan, you're not allowed to do it. When are you allowed to chew up the cumin? After the bris. After the bris, you're allowed to chew up the cumin. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, V'chein, Lo yoimar omul oisai, maybe you'll say it like this. Maybe you'll say, you know what? We don't have ground cumin, big deal. Omul oisai, we'll do the bris milah. Ooh. Now, after the bris, the tinoik is a chaylo sheyesh by sakana, eshchoik. Now I'll do an Issa D'Oraisa of Teichen. Why? Topikuach nefesh Teichen is Shabbos. Says the Chavetz Chaim, you can't say that. Again, what's the Mishnah Berurah saying? You might be tempted to say like this. Let's take the Shaila in order. We want to do a bris milah. Is bris milah Doicha Shabbos? Yes, bris milah is Doicha Shabbos. The Moel says, I don't have any ground cumin. That's all. Okay, don't worry about the fact that you don't have ground cumin. Right now, Mila is Doicha Shabbos. Priya is Doicha Shabbos. Mitzitza is Doicha Shabbos. Do Mila, do Priya, do Mitzitza. Now you need ground cumin. Oivei, the Rachanimel is a Chayla Sheyesh by Sakana. It's a Shaila of Pekuach Nefesh. Go take cumin and grind it. And do an Issa D'Oraisa. Why not? It's Pekuach Nefesh. Says the Chavetz Chaim, no, you can't make that cheshbon. The Kavan the Akshav Yedeya, Shei Efshaloi Beloisa Memonim Achra Mila, since you know going into the Mila that you don't have the ground cumin, you're not allowed to go ahead and do the bris Mila in order to cause the baby to be in a situation of Pekuach Nefesh, knowing that then you're going to have to do an Issa D'Oraisa. You're not allowed to do that. Mutav Tidacha Mila V'lo Yavi Atzmai Lidei Chelo Shabbos. Kevin Chaya Efshal Hakan Me'esmail. This is Efshal Asaisa Meba'od Yom. You should have done it yesterday. You have no right to go ahead now and perform the Mila, knowing that you're going to have to be Mechal Shabbos because you put the baby into a situation of Sakana. So now Mishum Pekuach Nefesh, you're going to do Teichen D'Oraisa. You're not allowed to do that. Now, take a look at Sharet Tzion, Ois Cotton Tezayin. On this halacha that we just said, that you're not allowed to do the bris milah and then afterwards go do Teichen D'Oraisa because the baby is in a situation of Pekuach Nefesh, on that, says the Chavetz Chaim in the Sharet Tzion, Roiv Paiskim. This is the position of Roiv HaPaiskim, the Loika HaRamban, not like the Ramban. It's a fascinating machlokes Rishonim over here. The Ramban on one side, the Rashba, I think the Meiri and others on the other side. The Ramban looks at this shaila, and the Ramban says, you don't have common shachok miba'od yom? No problem. Go ahead, do the bris milah. Once you do the bris milah, the baby is already pekuach nefesh. Now, if you have to, you could do Teichen D'Oraisa. Why does the Mishnah say loyes b'shinav? Why does the Mechaber say loyes b'shinav? Because if you could do it with a shinoi, do it with a shinoi. But if you can't do it with a shinoi, says the Ramban halacha l'maisa. As a matter of fact, the dibur hamaschil of the Ramban that this comes from is halacha. That's the dibur hamaschil of the Ramban. The Ramban says halacha l'maisa. You want to do a bris and you don't have kamun shachuk, says the Ramban, go ahead, do the bris milah, even if you know that you're going to have to go ahead and do Teichen Daraisa after the bris in order to get some ground cumin to put onto the wound. Why? Because says the Ramban, Ein le mitzvah ela shaita. The Ramban looks at it and says, we're very chronographical about this. We look at this shaila in order. Right now, the baby is here, the baby needs a bris milah, the moil is standing here, the shaila that's in front of us right now is, are we allowed to do a bris milah? The answer is yes, bris milah is doicha Shabbos. So, go ahead, do the milah. Next step, do the priya. Next step, do the mitzitza. Now, the baby is in sakana, you need cumin, okay, pikuach nevesh. Go ahead, take a rib eisen, and go ahead and grind cumin, teichen daraisa, and put it onto the wound. Now, have your head on you, says the Ramban. If you realize that you could create the ground cumin by chewing it up and doing teichen darabanan instead of doing teichen daraisa, do teichen darabanan, not teichen daraisa. That's the way the Ramban learns this sugya. The Rashba comes and the Rashba says no. The Rashba is not willing to go where the Ramban goes. The Rashba says that the halacha of this Mishnah is as follows. You want to do the bris milah, and you don't know that you don't have ground cumin. You think that you have ground cumin in the bag, but you go ahead and you did the bris milah. Now you realize there's no cumin in the bag. There's no ground cumin. Says the Rashba, okay, no, go ahead and grind it up with your teeth because you have no choice. But if says the Rashba, but if before you do the bris, you know that you don't have ground cumin, then don't do the bris. In other words, I want to be clear about this. The Rashba holds that the eitz of loyes bishinov, the eitz of chewing up the cumin with your teeth to generate the ground cumin, is only an eitzah if you went into the bris not realizing that you didn't have ground cumin. If you know before the bris that you don't have ground cumin, you're not allowed to do the bris. You're not allowed to do the bris knowing that after the bris, you're even going to have to do teichen derabanan. Forget teichen daraisa, but even teichen derabanan, because it's bakshirei milah she'efshel asayis b'ba'id, you're not allowed to do it. So if you know going into the bris that you don't have ground cumin, the Rashba says you're not allowed to do the bris. The Ramban says if you knew that you didn't have ground cumin before the bris, you're allowed to do the bris, and once you do the bris, you're even allowed to do teichen daraisa. So that's some of the background of what's going on in this sugya over here. It happens to be a fascinating sugya. Okay, continuing the Mishnah Berurah over here, 3 lines off the bottom. V'dan, you should know. The Mishnah Berurah makes the point. The Mishnah Berurah dances around these Rishonim a little bit. But here the Mishnah Berurah makes the point. What if you did the bris, and now that you did the bris is first when you discover that you don't have ground cumin? If you did the bris and now you discover you don't have ground cumin, you could do Isira Daraisa. You could bring ground cumin through the Rosh Hashanah and do Eitzah Daraisa. You could grind the cumin outright, Teichen Daraisa. However, if you could do it with a shinoi, if you could employ a shinoi without putting the baby into any kind of danger, you have to do a shinoi. Sif Yud Beis. Okay, that was the more complex part of today's share. Now let's go because we're not even on the page yet. Okay, says the Mechaber Weiter, the middle of the bottom line. Another refuah that they used to do for the milah was they would mix oil and warm water, beside wine. They would mix wine and oil and they would apply it to the wound. And the way they would do this generally would be, because oil and wine don't mix readily, they would put oil and wine into a bowl and they would beat it the way you beat eggs. Now, there's a problem doing that on Shabbos. It's an Issa D'Rabbanan. What's the Issa D'Rabbanan? When somebody walks in and they see you with a bowl and they see you beating something, it looks like you're about to fry an egg. It looks like you're getting ready to cook something. So it's an Issa D'Rabbanan that you can't go ahead and beat the wine and the oil in a plate or in a bowl together. Based on that, says the Mechaber, if you did not prepare the mixture of wine and oil on Erev Shabbos, litain aleha, in order to put it onto the wound. Turning to Kofayin Gimel Amid Beis, Lo Ya'arveim Hayom. You're not allowed to go ahead and mix it in the normal way, beat it together on Shabbos. You're not allowed to beat it on Shabbos because, again, this is Machshire Mila She'esher L'Asaisam B'Ayom. So you're not allowed to do it now. Ella, what should you do? Yitain kol echad levadoi. There's two different ways to learn what this means. We'll see in the Mishnah Berurah. The simple pshat is, instead of beating the oil and the wine together and putting it on the wound, you didn't do it before Shabbos. Put a little wine on the wound and then put a little oil on the wound. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Chaf Hey, back on Kufayin Gimel Amud Aleph at the bottom. Litain Aleh Kacha Yuragilin. This is what they were accustomed to doing. Vihi Refuah. This is was done for therapeutic purposes. Shema Arvin. They would mix vitarfin and beat bekaara in a plate or a bowl. Yayin vishemen, wine and oil. Kederach shetarfin beitza bekaara. The way you beat an egg on a plate. Turning to Kofayin Gimel Amid Beis, Ois Katan Chavav, Lo Ya'arveim Hayom. You're not allowed to beat them on Shabbos. Ella, what you should do is you should put on each one independently. Pirish, what this means, says the Mishnah Berurah, is the asa la'arvam b'ka'ara. You're not allowed to beat the wine and the oil together in a plate. Ella, rather, nice to b'zdeh b'fnei atzman amakayim hamaka, v'zeh b'fnei atzmai amakayim hamaka. Instead, what you do is you apply the wine separately to the wound, and you apply the oil separately to the wound. That's the first pshat. And the second pshat is, the second pshat over here is v'oid, or you could say, yesh lefarish the tarvayu b'ka'ara. You're not applying them independent of each other to the wound. What you're doing is you're putting each one independently into the plate. Ella, the noistim zebifnei atzmai. What you do is you put the wine into the bowl, and then you put the oil into the bowl. V'lo ya'arveim biyadayim, and you don't go ahead and mix them together. Ella im yisarvu, as much as they mix. That's how much they mix. Kein muchach mim'iri v'ayin bir alacha. So the Mishnah Berurah over here brought down two pshatim in what means that you can't mix the wine and the oil on Shabbos. Instead, what you should do is yitain kol echad levadoi. Pshat number one was put wine onto the wound, then put oil onto the wound. Pshat number two is no, put wine into the plate and then oil into the plate. Let them mix as much as they naturally mix, and then take from the mixture and put it onto the wound. The Mishnah Berurah closes out Ois Katan Chavav by saying ayin bir halacha. If you take in the bir halacha, take a look at the bir halacha. The bir halacha will give you the background. This is actually based on a machlokes tanoim and then a machlokes rishonim. Do we paskin like one tana or the other tana? It's an interesting bir halacha. Let's go weiter. Ois Katan Chav Zayin kol echad levadoi. Chasa Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef says, "The l'sha'ar chaylim nami also la'arev." You're not allowed to do this kind of mixing for other chaylim either. V'ayin bebir alacha da'idei shinoi lekulei alma shari. Yeah. Okay. Weiter. Sif Ches, middle of the top line, Kufayin Gimel and Beis, says the Mechaber. Ein oisin la chaluk. You're not allowed to make a hood for the Mokayim Hamila. So apparently back in the day, I think we could see this in the Mishnah Berurah. Take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Chav Ches. Chaluk. What does it mean to make a hood for the wound of the Mila? Ke'ein kis dachuk. What they would do is they would form, I guess the English word that I would use is a cap. In other words, let's say this is the Aver Habris. They would make like a cap that they would push. It was very tightly fitting onto the tip of the gid, onto the tip of the Aver Amila, and they would push it on. So they would form like a cap, and they would go and they would push it on firmly. And what was the point over here? So take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah says, Kein kis dachuk. This was like a pouch or a hood that was tight. Sha'oisim, that they would make. Umechasim roish hagid, and it would cover the tip of the aver of the bris, ad HaTorah, and it would go down to the corona. It would go down to the ridge that's around, down off the tip of the gid. And what was the point of this? Says the Mishnah Berurah. The kosher sham, they would tie it on there tightly, shelo yachzar ha'or lechasais hagid, They just went ahead and they cut off the arla. The arla is like a piece of skin, a hood, that covers up the top of the Aver Abris. You just cut it off. Then they went ahead and they peeled down the Ar HaPriya down to the HaTorah. Sometimes what could happen is there's loose skin, especially from the Ar HaPriya. Sometimes it could creep back up and it could cover the tip of the Aver Abris again. So what they would do is they would make this cap and they would push it on very tightly and firmly, and it would push down all the skin. It would keep the Ar HaPriya down, and it would prevent any of the skin from coming back up onto the tip of the Aver Abris. Says the Mechaber, you're not allowed to do this. And again, this comes also from a Mishnah in Masechta Shabbos. Why aren't you allowed to do this? It's very interesting that the Mishnah Berurah does not say what the Isser is. The Isser is Makeh B'Patish. When you make this hood, you're making a keli. It's the Isser of Makeh B'Patish. Okay. Says the Mechaber weiter. Let's go back to the beginning of Sivches. This is read from the beginning for continuity's sake. You cannot create this hood. Smartut. Instead, what you do is you take like a piece of rag, a bandage, and you wrap it around. In that case, you're not making any kind of keli. If you don't have one available. So again, the baby is in Unit 21, and in Unit 21, you don't have the necessary bandage. The necessary bandage is in Unit 13. What do? Says the Mechaber, if you don't have it, Kairach al etzba'i derech malbush. Take in Unit 13, where you have the bandage, wrap it around your finger. So it's like a garment on your finger. So in this way, you're carrying it with a shinui. And now bring it through a chotzer she'ena me'ureves. So you're not doing haitzah daraisa with a shinui. You're doing haitzah darabanan with a shinui. Now remember, isurei darabanan, machshirei mila, that are awesome darabanan, that are efshel asaysim ba'odyayim, are not doiche Shabbos. But over here, what you're doing is, you're doing machshirei mila. You're bringing the bandage, which is machshirei mila. It's an issa derabanan because you're bringing it through a chaser she'ena me'ureves, which is a tzad derabanan, but you're doing it with a shinui. You're wrapping it around your finger. So you're doing an issa derabanan with a shinui. That's machshirei mila that are efshel asaysim b'odyayim. Says the Mechaber, that you're allowed to do. That's the way the Gra understands this Mechaber. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois katan chavtes ve'im, if you don't have the smartut, if you don't have the bandage, even if before you perform the mila you realize you don't have the necessary bandage, don't push off the mila until Sunday. There's an eitzah. The eitzah is put it on your finger, carry it through the chaser she'enim ureves, do an issa d'rabbanan with a shinoi. That's okay. Kain mashpa b'yeridea reish samachvav b'hagra ayin sham. Oiskat lamed. You're doing this through chatzar acheres aval derech rishus harabim aser. But would you be allowed to carry the smartut through rishus harabim? No. Kain she'ena derech malbush mamish, because wrapping it around your finger does not turn it into a garment. You're not really wearing a garment. So you're right. It would be a haitzah daraisa with a shinui, but that makes it an issa d'rabbanan. Okay, machshirei mila, efshel asaysim ba'odyayim, an issa d'rabbanan, it's aser. What we're being mater is to wrap it around your finger and take it through a chaser she'ena me'ureves. So haitzah d'rabbanan with a shinoi you could do. Haitzah d'araisa through a rishus harabim with a shinoi you cannot do, because that's an issa d'rabbanan. V'derech karmelis b'tzad del yirab lahater ayin shop. Moving along to Sif Tes, says the Mechaber. Bizman Chachmei Gemara, in the times of Chazal, if they didn't wash the baby before the bris and after the bris, and on day 3 after the bris, b'mayin chamin, in hot water, hayu misukan, that was a sakana. Not they thought it was a sakana. It was known to be a sakana. So back in the time of Chazal, it was known as a fact that for a baby, you needed to wash the baby in hot water before the bris, you needed to wash the baby in hot water after the bris, and you had to wash the baby in hot water on day 3 after the bris. If you didn't, it was a sakana. Lefikach, because those were the facts in the time of Chazal, niskaku lichtov mishpatoi kishachal liyos b'Shabbos. For that reason, Chazal in Masechta Shabbos had to write the halacha of what you're allowed to do before the bris milah, if the bris milah is on Shabbos, after the bris milah, if the bris milah is on Shabbos, and on day 3 of the bris milah, if day 3 fell out on Shabbos. Chazal had to tell us what the halach is. Are you allowed to wash the baby in hot water on Shabbos or not? They had to write this because it was considered a sakana. But, says the Machaber, as far as we're concerned, nowadays, nowadays, the facts are different. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say that nishtana hateva, the teva changed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol nihiyeh b'dvarei. It says that now the teva changed. And since the teva changed, now it's not a sakana. You don't have to wash the baby in hot water. And therefore, says the Machaber, v'dinoi, therefore the halacha is, v'dinoi l'rchaitz b'Shabbos, if you want to know what the halacha is as far as washing the baby in hot water on Shabbos, imratzu kidin rechitzas kaladam. If you want to wash the baby in hot water on Shabbos, somehow because of the bris milah, it's the same halacha as you yourself going and taking a bath. You're not allowed to go ahead and take a bath on Shabbos. You're not allowed to do rechitzas kalaguf in mayim chamin. We don't even do it in cold water. So, again, what the Mechaber has said here so far is the din of rechitza b'chamin for a baby before, after, and on day 3 after a bris, in the time of Chazal, was a different halacha. Because in those days it was a sakana. Nowadays, it's not a sakana. So you want to know what the halacha is? You want to give the baby a hot bath before the bris, after the bris, day 3? You want to know what the halacha is? Go learn the halachas of rechitza on Shabbos. The same halacha that applies to me and you applies to the baby. Says, let's see Mishnah Berurah's Lamed Aleph. Loi nagu, why are we not noyeg nowadays to wash the baby? Denishtanu hatvoim, because the teva changed. It used to be a sakon. It's not a sakon anymore. Now let's see the Ramah. Says the Ramah 4 lines off the bottom, beginning of the line. Hago. Ubi Medina Elu, says the Ramah, in our regions, the minhag nowadays, says the Ramah, was to wash the baby in hot water on Shabbos. So if the bris fell out on Shabbos, they washed the baby in hot water on Shabbos. But they did it using water that was heated up before Shabbos. So they wouldn't do an issa daraisa in order to go heat up water to wash the baby. They would heat up water before Shabbos. And they would give the baby a hot bath before the milah using water that was heated before Shabbos. Now that's an issa d'Rabbanan, because you're doing rechitzas kalaguf in mayim chamin. That's an issa d'Rabbanan. Why are you allowed to do it? Because it's ef shalasaysa miba'id yom. You had to wash the baby right before the bris, so it's not possible to do it miba'id yom. Machshirei milah that are ef shalasaysa miba'id yom are doicha Shabbos, and this is only an issa d'Rabbanan. So says the Ramah. Nowadays, and after the bris, Shabbos, they would wait till Motzei Shabbos and give the baby a hot bath on Motzei Shabbos. Similarly, if day 3 after the bris landed on Shabbos, and they see that this baby needs to be bathed in hot water, they would prepare hot water from Friday for Shabbos and give him a hot bath on Shabbos. Again, Issa d'Rabbanan, right? But it's necessary, so they would do it. The Cholzem in Astam, that's in a default case. If somehow the Moil says that this baby needs a hot water after the bris, otherwise he's going to be at sakana, then it's a chayil sheish by sakana. You're allowed to give him a bath, and it's a d'Rabbanan. You're allowed to heat up water, and it's a d'Oraisa. Midi dahava ashar chayil sheish by sakana. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Oiskat Lamed Beis. Uve Medina Isenu. Says the Ramah Kaloimar. In our regions, even though, says the Ramah, that Taka the Teva changed, and we don't consider it a sakana like it was in the time of Chazal, I'll call upon him still and all, Tzorich Godel Yesh Badavar. The Ramah says that even in his days, it was considered a tzorich gadol to bathe the baby in hot water before the bris. Lefikach, therefore, al rechitza shekoydem amila, as far as the hot bath before the bris, hinichu al dina de Gemara. They gave the same din that Chazal said, that you could go give the baby a bath in hot water that was heated up before Shabbos. Because the truth is, why not? What is that? It's an Issa D'Rabbanan, but it's machshirei mila she'efshar la'asaysam miba'od yom. So yeah, so it's Doicha Shabbos. So go ahead and do it. Okay. And after the bris, ain't kpeda im yamteinu ad Motzei Shabbos, but after the bris, they already discovered that there was no harm in waiting until Motzei Shabbos. Ois katan lamed gimel, noi hagim l'rachtzai, v'yizar shali. Oh, now the Mishnah Berurah, as is his derech, he's telling you, all right, the Ramah says that you're going to give the baby a hot bath on Shabbos. So now you have to keep your head on, and you have to make sure that you understand the other ancillary Shabbos issues that are going to be involved in giving the baby a bath. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'yizar shelo yashre sadin b'mayim. If you're using a towel, you can't let the towel go into the bath. You can't soak the towel into the bath. Why? Dishriyasa kibusai. Because we learned in Siman Shin Beis, when we were learning about rechitza, to take a beged and soak it in water, shriyasai, soaking it, zui kibusai, is called laundering it. So you're not allowed to do laundering on Shabbos, so you can't let the towel soak in the water. But it could be you could be makel to allow an Eini Yehudi to soak a washcloth. Why? Why could you be makel? Because the truth is, there are two mitigating factors over here. One is, presumably, you're talking about a clean towel. So by a clean towel, to say shriyasai zui kibusai, you don't launder a clean towel. So how is it laundering? That's one mitigating factor. The other mitigating factor is that this is derech lichluch. Once you use the towel to bathe the baby, the next step for this towel is it's going into the laundry. So how could you say it's shriyasai zui kibusai? You're not laundering it now, you're actually getting it dirty now. So we go back to what we learned in Shit Beis. These are mitigating factors, right? One is that it's clean, and the other one is that what you're doing now is derech lichluch. So to do it al yidei Eini Yehudi, says the Mishnah Berurah, you could be efshar sheyesh lahagam. V'em yizar mischitas hasadin, v'gam yizar mischitas hasadin. Also, you have to make sure not to wring out the towel, because that would be schita. V'em nishpach hachamen, if the hot water that you prepared from Erev Shabbos got spilled out, yachal lomer la'eini Yehudi lahave mayim shehu chamoy b'shvil eino Yehudi. You could go ahead and you could ask an Eino Yehudi to bring some water, some hot water, through a chatzar she'enoi mu'ureves, even though it's an Issa D'Rabbanan, as long as that hot water was heated up for him or for another guy. You can't ask him to go heat up water for you, because that's a mir la'akam on a daraisa. What the Mishnah Berurah is suggesting is a mir la'akam on an Issa D'Rabbanan. You're not asking him to heat up water. He has hot water that he heated up for his own bath. Problem is he has to bring it through a chatzar she'edim ureves. You could ask him to bring it, because it's a mir la'akum on hoitzad rabbanon. It's a shvus to shvus b'makom tzorich gadol. A shvus to shvus b'makom mitzvah, a shvus to shvus b'makom tzorich gadol is mutter. Aval lo yomer le'eini Yehudi l'hachem l'chatchila, because that would be a mir la'akum on a daraisa. Tinoik shaya chayla v'nisrape. If the baby was a chayla and then he got better. Oiser atashbeitz l'mulay b'yom chamishi. The Tashbat says you can't do a bris on Thursday. So you had a baby that was ill. He got better before the bris. The bris fell out on Thursday. You want to do a bris on Thursday. Tashbat says you can't do a bris on Thursday. Why? Because we know that we're dealing with a shvacha baby, and you're creating a situation where now you might need to do Chil Shabbos on day 3. Tashbat says you're not allowed to do that. So therefore you should do the bris. The Ramah said, if you see that the baby needs to be bathed, if you see before Shabbos that on day 3 the baby is going to have to be bathed, so prepare chamim b'od yom. But if you didn't prepare hot water from Erev Shabbos, also lahachim al yidei Eini Yehudi. In other words, on day 3, we don't assume that the baby is a chayla sheish by sakana. But if the doctor says he needs a hot bath, then you can't be machmer. So you would ask an Yehudi to heat up water. Hey, if you know that the baby is in sakana, certainly it's mutter l'chala l'ava Shabbos. Hainu afilu l'hachim ba'atzmai. That means you could even go be a daim, a Yisrael himself, make a fire and heat up water because you're dealing with a chayla sheyesh by sakana. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe Shem should send Yeshua Sefurus Parnas and Sheduchim to those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Kol Tzedek. B'meher v'yameinu Amen. Be well.